It's wonderful to see so many of you coming, being excited about poetry, and to welcome so many people to the Wellesley College community. So I'm very, very pleased. There's so much I want to say about Ed Hirsch, so I decided to write it. And I think that this way I will do my best to honor his presence and his poetry. So I'm at this age that I need my glasses. Okay, thank you. And I also want to thank Winnie Wood for also her enthusiasm and the support for Ed's visit, as well as Spanish Department, Jewish Studies, the Davis Museum. They've done a beautiful, beautiful job with a broadside. So I think that all of us have collaborated to make this visit a wonderful possibility. Okay. Octavio Paz said that poets do not have a biography, that we can only find their biographies in their books. And before I speak about Edward Hirsch as a poet, I am compelled to share some of his accomplishments. I don't know all of them, but I will just mention a few. Among them, a MacArthur Genius Award, Prix de Rome, Guggenheim Fellow, and Pablo Neruda Medal of Honor, and also the fourth president of the Guggenheim Foundation. It is an honor that a working artist shares his humanistic and creative vision as president of such a foundation. Ed Hirsch is also a brilliant essayist in the tradition of Emerson, Paz, Steiner, and his book, How to Read a Poem, a national bestseller that only a poet of his adventuresome imagination could have written. A book that inspires and invites audiences to participate in the celebratory feast of language, not as a destination but as a journey that ultimately illuminates, transforms, and alters our understanding of the world through the enchantment of poetry as a participatory dialogue of poet and reader. Ed Hirsch has Garcia Lorca's Duende, an intuitive, mysterious, uncanny intuition of poetic revelation. His book, The Demon and the Angel, explores the enigma of creativity, the crevices of imagination, and the infinite possibilities found in the mystery of art. These two books have been for me companions of the night that have revealed secrets and wonders, and I carry these books with me as a treasure map of human possibilities. As a poet, he writes with craft, a poised decorum as well as a passion, an elegance of an artist grateful for the world's poetic traditions, from Homer to Dante to Neruda to Celan to Amihai, but his voice is very much his own, a voice of grace and emotion, connected with the inner self of the poet, as well as the belief that poetry alleviates human suffering. On Love is a meditation on intimate friendship, as well as dialogues with other writers, from Dickinson to Stein to Lorca to Jimi Hendrix. Earthly Measures and explorations of human frailties and cravings, The Night Parade, A Poetic History of the City of Chicago, and his most recent book, Lay Back the Darkness, Reflections on Mortality, Judaism, and the Engagement with the Past through the Darkness of Greek Mythology. Edward Hirsch, I believe, is able through his poetry to transcend political and historical communities and really create communities of artists that cross borders and languages. As Rilke once said in a letter to a young poet, read the lines as though they were someone else's, and you will feel deep within you how much they are your own. Ed Hirsch allows us to be a poem, to read a poem, like a heavenly blanket amidst the darkness. Poetry is an act of courage, as well as an act of love, telling and retelling of humane journeys and destinies that ultimately, as Rimbaud said, will take us to the splendid city of knowledge, which is also beauty. We welcome you to Wellesley College, a home that has welcomed great writers from Nabokov, Guillen, Salinas, David Ferry, Frank Bidard, Alex Johnson, Marilyn Seid, Margaret Cesar Thompson, Diana Chapman Walsh, and we welcome you. Thank you.
I'm so happy to be with you. Thank you for coming. The video machine says, please select a source or function. It's too late, I think. I love our auditorium. I think it's because I was just in Chattanooga, and I read in just a huge cavernous place. And there were about this many people, but they were all in the front. There were two students sitting way in the back. So I went around before the reading, and I said, hi, what are you doing here? They said, oh, our teacher said we could get extra credit if we came to the reading. I said, yeah, but why are you sitting so far in the back? They said, oh, when this guy starts, we're going to sneak out. That had a certain je ne sais quoi. What I want to do is I'm going to begin in my pleasure in being with you. I want to begin with a little poem by Walt Whitman. But I want to tell you what I want to do, which is I'm going to read something by Whitman, and then I'm going to read about my first encounter with a poem when I was 8 years old. And I'm going to talk to you about, informally, about what I think is involved in the relationship between the poet, the poem, and the reader, in that kind of encounter, which I think poetry is an encounter. And then I'm going to read some of my own poems, and finish with something about poetry as a participatory act. Poetry is an act of reciprocity. And then I hope you'll have some questions for me. We can have a kind of conversation about poetry. But first, in the pleasure of beginning, here's a poem by Whitman called Beginning My Studies. Beginning my studies, the first step pleased me so much. The mere fact consciousness, these forms, the power of motion, the least insect or animals, the eyesight, senses, the least insect or animal, the senses, eyesight, love. The first step, I say, awed me and pleased me so much. I've hardly gone and hardly wish to go any farther, but stop and loiter all the time to sing it in ecstatic songs. And then just a word about this. I relish the way that Whitman lingers in this one-sentence poem over the very first step of studying. The mere fact, the miracle of consciousness itself, the joy of encountering these forms, the empowering sense of expectation and renewal, the whole world blooming at hand, the awakened mental state that takes us through our senses from the least insect to the highest power of love. We can scarcely turn the page, so much do we linger with pleasure over the ecstatic beginning. We are instructed by Whitman in the joy of starting out that the deepest spirit of poetry is awe. I don't think we should underestimate the capacities for tenderness that poetry opens up inside us. Throughout my book, How to Read a Poem, it's a celebration of reading, not a celebration of writing. And throughout, I try to take the role of the reader. And because I think that this has been underestimated in thinking about poetry and what's required from poetry to be meaningful. And I just want to read you a little section of my first encounter with a poem when I was a child. My idea is that an encounter with an individual poem initiates me into a kind of poetry. It introduces me to something I didn't know before. And this one poem leads to a series of other poems, leads to a premise or an idea of poetry that seems to me crucial to the history of poetry and to thinking about poetry. So the second one, I'm just going to read you the first one. The second one is about when I was in high school, and I stumbled into a section of a poem by Christopher Smart, a section of his poem called Jubilate Agno, which you may know about as Cat Jeffrey, a celebration of his cat Jeffrey. And I felt as if I had wandered into some whacked-out version of the Psalms. And later I discovered that I was right. I didn't even know how right I was. It was because he was really trying to create his own religious service in this passionate poem to his, insane poem to his cat. And this initiates me into the poetry of praise or celebration, which I think is a permanent impulse in poetry. What I mean by that is that poetry precedes prose in all languages. There's never been a culture without poetry, to my knowledge. I don't know all the cultures, but every culture I know about, there's never been one without poetry. And poetry comes first before prose. It's more ancient. It's more archaic. It's a first source of knowledge. And in all the poetries that I know around the world, praise is one of the key elements. That is, every poetry that exists has this element of praise or celebration. And then the third section is I was a freshman at Grinnell College. Forgive me for invoking another college. I mean, I wanted to come to Wellesley. I had the idea I should come, but I don't know. Something went awry. I wasn't ready to face what it would take. So I was a freshman in college, and my freshman humanities teacher, who was the first person I'd ever met who spoke in full sentences, so that right there got my attention. She began to read a section from the Iliad, in which Achilles mourns over the death of Patroclus. And if you know this section, he goes down in the dirt and begins to pour dirt over his head. He's so completely grief-stricken, so overwhelmed by grief at the death of his brother. And I don't know what I felt. I felt an unbelievable thing open up inside of me, some enormous sadness, some lamentation that I didn't really understand. But I felt transported by it. And I tell in the chapter how when I was in my 30s and my closest friend got sick with liver cancer and then died, and I was overcome by grief, I realized that what I had actually experienced, what I was actually experiencing in life, was something I actually experienced in literature first. And that what I felt was what I had felt when I was in that classroom, but I hadn't quite recognized it. And so this proto-lyric from the Iliad introduces me to the poetry of grief. And I also believe that grief is one of the permanent forms of poetry. The poetry exists in part to deliver grief and to help us ritually deal with grief. The oldest examples we have of lyric activity, the Egyptian pyramid texts, have poems, odes, poems in celebration, and poems of lamentation, poems to ease the dead on their passage to the next world. And so I believe that praise and grief are two sides of poetry that are everywhere apparent in poetry and everywhere necessary. So that's the part that I'm not reading, part 2 and 3. So this is my first initiation. I was initiated into the poetry of trance on a rainy Saturday afternoon in mid-October 1958. Baseball season was over for the year when I wandered down to the basement of our house to pick through some of my grandfather's forgotten books. I was 8 years old. I vaguely remembered that my grandfather had copied poems into the inside cover of his favorite volumes, and I decided to try to find one. I didn't yet know that after his death, his books had been given away to a local Jewish charity, and that his poems were thereby lost forever. I opened a musty anthology of poetry to a section called Night, and read a poem that immediately arrested me. The night is darkening round me, the wild winds coldly blow, but a tyrant spell has bound me, and I cannot go. The giant trees are bending, their bare boughs wade with snow, and the storm is fast descending, and yet I cannot go. Clouds beyond clouds above me, wastes beyond wastes below, but nothing drear can move me. I will not, cannot go. There was no title or author's name attached to this song-like poem, and I somehow imagined that my grandfather must have written it. I read it right straight through, and its simple incremental rhythm seized me. I read it again slowly, pronouncing every word to myself, and suddenly I was in two places at once. I was standing next to a bookshelf in a small one-windowed room in my parents' basement, and I was lost in the middle of a field somewhere in southern Latvia with a storm wildly brewing around me. I felt as though the words of the poem, like the storm itself, had cast a tyrant spell upon me. I couldn't move. I can still feel the terrible immediacy of this poem written in the present tense. I couldn't tell if the poem was a charm inviting the storm into the world or a spell warding it off. I read stanza 1 and felt the dusk purpling around me, an icy wind blowing out of control, invisible hands holding me by the shoulders. I said, and I cannot go. The repetitive stresses were like two blows to my chest. I recited stanza 2 and felt the enormous weight of winter coming down. I could feel the giant trees giving way, their limbs burdened with snow. I was far from home. The storm was coming after me, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I stubbornly repeated the refrain, and yet I cannot go. The word go, which rhymes with snow, was like a door slamming in my head. I said stanza 3 aloud and felt I was standing in the middle of the world. I saw clouds stretching beyond clouds above me. They were layered all the way to heaven. I saw barren spaces stretching out endlessly below, the blasted country of hell. But I was firmly planted on the ground, a tree rooted to the earth. I took heart from the line, but nothing drear can move me. I recognized the word drear from Poe's The Raven. Once upon a midnight dreary. I knew the double meaning of the word move, so the gloomy storm couldn't affect me or make me give way. I wouldn't budge. I asserted, I will not, cannot go. I felt a deep resolve, and for a moment when I said it, I remember how I had stood on the hood of a car in the parking lot across the street from the hospital where my grandfather had gone to die. I started waving wildly, furiously, when I saw him standing at the window on the 7th floor. I remembered how he'd pressed his lips to the glass and then touched the spot with his hand. It was the same way he used to kiss me on the upper arm at night and then seal the kiss with his fingertips, a gesture of unworldly tenderness. And then I remembered how I'd stood by the side of my grandfather's grave when they lowered him into the ground. I threw a shovel of dirt onto the coffin, like the other men. Some kindness had passed out of the world, but I wouldn't move away. I would never give him up. The storm was coming right for me, but suddenly I had the words for what I'd felt then. I was determined by what I could not resist. I said, I will not, cannot go. I don't know how long I stood there on that rainy Saturday afternoon, lost in a book in the basement of my childhood house, in the middle of a field somewhere in Latvia, in a cluttered Jewish cemetery on the south side of Chicago, on an English moor. It would be years before I discovered I'd been reading a lyric by Emily Bronte. I recognized the style as soon as I encountered No Coward Soul Is Mine. I suppose that in some sense I never really shut that worn anthology of poetry again because it had opened up an unembarrassed space in me that would never be closed. I had stumbled into the sublime. I had been initiated into the poetry of awe. You can imagine my surprise when I was in high school. We're looking through an anthology, and I'm going, this is strange. This poet writes so much like my grandfather. It's very peculiar. It's exactly the same grandpa's poem. So I was wrong about the author, but I feel I was right about the poem. My reading of it was accurate, but I was off on the authorship by just a little. My idea, I have a particular idea that I want to share with you about poetry, which is poetry as an act of reciprocity. That is, I don't believe that poems really exist in a vacuum. I believe they exist in a relationship between a poet, a poem, and a reader. That poems, when a poet writes a poem, that is some part of what a poem is. But that poem is not actually completed. It doesn't actually exist until it's actually met by a reader. And the reader brings something to the poem and brings poetry into a kind of relationship. And I'm taking this idea as a kind of credo for readers. And I'm borrowing an idea from the great poet Paul Celan, who said that a poem is a message in a bottle, or he says actually a poem as a manifestation of language, and thus essentially dialogue, can be a message in a bottle, sent out in the not always greatly hopeful belief that somewhere and sometime it could wash up on land, on Heartland perhaps. Poems in this sense too are underway. They are making towards something. Now, it so happens that Celan is echoing something that he found in a little piece by the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam. And in 1916, Mandelstam wrote a little piece called On the Addressee, which I like terrifically, in which he picks up this idea as a reader finding a message in a bottle. He says, at a critical moment, a seafarer tosses a sealed bottle into the ocean waves, containing a name containing his name and a message detailing his fate. Wandering along the dunes many years later, I happen upon it in the sand. I read the message, note the date, the last will and testament of one who has passed on. I have the right to do so. I have not opened someone else's mail. The message in the bottle was addressed to its finder. I found it. That means I have become its secret addressee. So this is what I think reading is. That is, a poem is sent out like a message in a bottle. It's addressed to some future reader. The poet doesn't actually know who that reader is. There's some faith, maybe not always greatly hopeful, as Paul Celan said, but there's some faith, some hope in finding some future connection. And a reader comes down, as like someone wandering on the shore and finds a bottle and opens it up, something from the past, and reads it, and therefore that message was addressed to whoever found it. I found it, therefore I feel it was addressed to me. This gives this message in a bottle life. And I know you've all had the experience of reading some poems that you know must be great but leave you somewhat cold. But other poems that you've read that feel as if they were written just to you. And this is one of the mysteries of poetry, that you can read a poem that seems as if that was written as if it were addressed to anyone out there, and it feels as if it has your name on it. That it has it dramatizes something of your own inner life, some experience that you've had, that you bring to it, and you recognize yourself in it. Sometimes you find something strange that you don't recognize, but sometimes you find something that you recognize deeply in it, and you feel this poem belongs to you. And initiated readers of poetry find a lot of poems like like this. And these poems are more important to me than all the whole history of poetry in a way. That is, what you need, the history of poetry is important, but what you need are these poems that speak directly to you. And if you find these poems, you become a reader of poetry. You become, in fact, addicted to reading poetry. And if you don't, then poetry is always something that floats on the surface for you. Sometimes it's not interesting, sometimes it's something that interests you. But you don't deeply understand what poetry is for until you find poems that speak directly to your inner life. So this is an idea of reading as reciprocity. And this is why you'll see that in thinking about reading poetry and the nature of poetry, instead of in the beginning was the word, I prefer something that Martin Buber said, in the beginning is the relation. And Buber says in the beginning is the relation because the relation precedes the word. It's authored by the human. Now, I just can't help but pointing out to you that I've just turned the reading of poetry into a Jewish activity. I wanted you to know. I didn't want it to go by. I'm thinking of poetry now, not at a poetry reading, but in your reading poetry, as a particular kind of contact or communication between strangers. That is, I'm thinking as a kind of communique between two people who are not actually physically present to each other, people who don't know each other. And one of the oddities of poetry is it speaks of such deep things between people who don't actually know each other. Maybe if you have a lot of friends who are poets, that's one thing. But let's say that in the reading of poetry, you don't know the people that you're reading. You're actually reading their poems. You know them through their work. You actually don't know them in any kind of social way. And this contact you have between what you bring and what you read feels deeper to you than a lot of the social contexts you have, which is my own case. That is, I was puzzled by this when I began reading poetry, why this inner contact that I had with poetry seemed so much deeper and to connect to me so much more deeply than the people I had around me. Why I couldn't speak as closely to the people around me as I could to these poems by people I didn't know. And I think that's strange. And I think it's a strangeness that's actually part of lyric discourse. And when you read a poem, and I like to suggest reading poems late at night, not only because I'm an insomniac, and I sort of create an apologia for insomniacs, but because I don't care when you read it, but I like the space that you create in the early morning or late at night when you are just alone with the words on the page, so you can block out the kind of constant buzzing noise of the culture, which is everywhere around us. And when you read a poem late at night, you are alone with the words of another. Now, that is by definition social. That is because language is social, because language is something we participate in together. You're not alone just with your own feelings. It's not like you're alone just with your own diary, which is one thing. But you're alone with the words of another. Now, because of the spaces that poetry opens, you're often in the depth of some deep emotional experience. And you bring your own emotion to this, and the emotion from the poem comes to you. And so you're both in a state that's very vulnerable and a state that's also participatory. And I believe that poems deliver on our spiritual lives precisely because they give us this gift of intimacy with another and interiority. They give us privacy and participation. And this odd doubleness, it creates a space in which lyric poetry, the most intense form of literary discourse, exists. And you see this doubleness that I'm talking about. It's not just your own feelings. It's quite wonderful to be alone with your own feelings, or it's horrifying to be alone with your own feelings, or whatever it is. But that's not exactly the same thing as being alone with a poem. You are alone with your own feelings, but you're also alone with the words of another. And so there is some kind of contact, some kind of connection. And this is participatory. And for this reason, for me, there's no poem that's too despairing. Even though poems can be seemingly despairing, the fact that they're written as poems and not just jotted down, the fact that they're written to be read, that implies that the message in the bottle has been crafted in some way. And it's sent out towards some future reader. I find that hopeful. I find that a deep experience. The first time I had a full-fledged experience in this way was when I was starting out reading poetry in college, and I was a complete blank slate. So I didn't know anything. So as soon as anyone mentioned a name, it was all news to me. But I just went and read everything I heard about. So mostly terror is a motivator, as you know, when you go to college. So I was terrified because I knew so little. But whenever I heard of something, I would go and read it. And I can say that if you do this for 30 years, you do learn something. It is a way to get educated in poetry and other things, too. So someone had mentioned Gerard Manley Hopkins. And I had never heard of him, and so I went and got a book, and I went back into my dorm room, and I started reading a poem. And the poem began like this. I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. What hours we have spent this night, what sights you, heart saw, ways you went, and more must in yet longer lights delay. With witness I speak this. Where I say hours, I mean years, mean life. And my lament is cries countless, cries like dead letters sent to dearest him who lives, alas, away. I am gall, I am heartburn, and so forth. I just was stunned by this poem. I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. What hours, oh, what black hours you have spent this night. What sights you, heart saw, ways you went, and more must in yet longer lights delay. With witness I speak this, for I say hours, I mean years, mean life, and my lament is cries countless, cries like dead letters sent to dearest him who lives, alas, away. I was stunned that Hopkins was articulating some desolation that I had felt and that I couldn't name. There was some tremendous loneliness that I had experienced, but I didn't know how to. I didn't know how to name it. I didn't know how to write it. I didn't know how to give any clarity to it. And when I read it in one of what were later I discovered were called the Terrible Sonnets, I recognized it immediately, and it was haunting to me. Later, this became even stranger to me, and it became a kind of metaphor for reading poetry. At the time, I just was amazed that anyone at all could articulate something that I had felt. That just seemed stunning to me. Later, I thought, this is really peculiar that a 19th century Jesuit writing in Ireland can write a poem that a Jewish kid from Chicago sitting in a dorm room in Iowa can read in 1968 and feel that this poem speaks to him more deeply than anything else he's ever read. This is extraordinary. And I had a first-hand experience of what Robert Graves calls stored magic, that the poem is going around as a form of stored magic. It's just waiting in the words. And then you read it, and the words release themselves inside you. And I had that experience. And then I began looking at the poem more closely, because I was writing poetry, and I go, I'd like to do something like this. And then I started looking, and I go, oh shit, this thing is a sonnet. You mean he didn't just write this down the way I'm writing down my poems? So that began to, that seeped in. I understood that this poem spoke with tremendous immediacy to me, but he couldn't have just dashed it off, that it had this kind of form, and the form had released itself in me. So it made me think a little differently about what form was doing. And I came to one of the central premises of poetry without knowing what I was doing. Although at that point I was reading a lot of poems, and some of them affected me deeply in this way. And I decided I wanted to try and make something like that. And when I feel that from that moment that I started to say, instead of just writing my feelings, which is what I'd been doing before that, at that point I said, I want to try and make something like that. I believe that at that point I started to become a poet. Not necessarily a good poet, but a poet in the sense that I was trying to actually make something. And I recognized that a poem was something, it wasn't a diary entry. It was something that had been made. It was an experience. And the experience lived in the words. And when I read those words, they enacted something so that I could have this experience. It didn't tell me about something. It enacted it so I could actually have the experience. It released itself inside of me. And I decided, I'd like to do that. That seems generous to me. That seems, instead of just making a diary of what you'd felt, you'd actually try and make something that would live apart from you so that someone else could have that experience. And that struck me as hopeful, hard and painful, but it struck me as a central premise of poetry. That before then I was trying to make diary entries, and I was interested in poetry as a record of my own emotional life. But after that I was I was still interested in that, but a little less interested in that. I was more interested in what I could do with my feelings and what I felt and transforming them into something else. And I had discovered, without knowing what I discovered, I'd stumbled on a central premise of poetry, which is with the idea of poesis, which is that poetry means making. The oldest word for poetry in Greek is poesis, and it means making, and that a poet is a maker, and a poem is a made thing. And this idea, I think, is at the heart of poetry. This in a wonderful poem called Advice to the Players, Frank Bedard goes even further than my notion of a poem as a made thing. He says, there's something missing in our vision of a human being, the need to make. That is, he's saying the need to make is a premise of actually being human. And then he says later in the poem, we are creatures who need to make. So if a poem is a made thing, and we're creatures who need to make, then this helps to explain one of the outlets of our making as poetry, is one of the essential forms of our knowledge. I happen to believe that that poetry exists because it carries a kind of information and knowledge that we can't get elsewhere. If we could get it elsewhere, actually, I think we would. Because it's hard to get the news through poems. It's complicated to read them. It takes a lot of attention to read them. But I tend to believe that poems exist not because some people like to write them and some people like to read them, but because they actually carry some information that we can't get elsewhere. That poems exist through time, and that all cultures have them, because they carry a kind of information, a kind of knowledge, a kind of feeling that you can't get in other places. And therefore there's something specific to poetry. Yes, in every culture there are some people who seem to be especially drawn to writing it, and some people seem especially drawn to listening to it and to reading it. But I think these people, and I'm one of them, are instruments of this larger thing. That is, in human culture, something needs to be perceived, and someone has to do that work in the culture and the society. And we're workers as part of this larger thing. It's not just accidental that every culture has this. It's crucial to actually the way in which the culture carries a certain kind of information, a certain kind of knowledge. Now, sometimes my feelings about poetry in this way vacillate. What vacillates is my sense that in everything in poetry is dependent upon the words themselves. That everything comes down to language. Sappho says, mere air these words, but delicious to hear. And the way I vacillate is sometimes I'm stunned by the tremendous power that these words have. And sometimes I'm shocked that all we have to go on are these words, these mouthfuls of air, as Yeats says, this voice, this breath. That's actually all there is, strikes me as really quite shocking. There are a couple lines by Cavalcante that I like very much, where he says, "We are the poor bewildered quills, the little scissors and the grieving penknife." That is, everything depends on these little things. And now it turns out that this feeling I have about everything being dependent upon the words is not just true of poetry, but it's true of all literature. And here's something that Italo Calvino says in 6 Moments for the Next Millennium. All realities and fantasies can take on form only by means of writing, in which outwardness and inwardness, the world and I, experience and fantasy, appear composed of the same verbal material. The polymorphic vision of the eyes and the spirit are contained in uniform lines of small or capital letters, periods, commas, parentheses, pages of signs packed as closely together as grains of sand, representing the many-sided spectacle of the world as a surface that is always the same and always different, like dunes shifted by the desert wind. This idea that everything is the series of these signs, one of the great human inventions, but surprisingly ineffable and also durable, is one of the mysteries of literature. I'm sure that you've all had the experience that I've had, that I was having when I was reading the Hopkins poem, that a poem speaks so deeply to you that you feel almost as if you are writing the thing to what you are actually only reading. That you are responding, but in fact you feel as if you're creating this. The great Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges puts this most beautifully and comically in an apology to his first book of poems, where he says, "Dear reader, please forgive me for having written this poem first. We are all one. It is only something of an accident that you are the reader and I am the writer, the unsure, ardent writer of these verses." So there's something disingenuous about that, but there's also something true. There's something of an accident in it, and that this communication is between these words. So that's what I say to you as I set out to read a few of my poems. It's only something of an accident that you're listening, and I am the unsure, ardent writer of these poems. I want to begin with a few poems out of childhood, and this is called The Poet at 7. And in this poem, I'm trying to think about how, on the one hand, you could be living in an ordinary middle-class American life. Whenever I read that poem, they leave. They go around the country with me. And they wait, and then they leave as soon as It's a humbling experience. It's a humbling experience. But then these two come. Anyway, this is called... So if you leave, I will make fun of you. I will make fun of you. So be prepared. Be prepared. So I'm trying to think of how in this poem, how you could be living an ordinary middle-class American childhood on the one hand, and how on the other some other strange destiny, your fate, your vocation as a poet is already preparing itself for you. So the poet at 7. He could be any 7-year-old on the lawn, holding baseball in his hand, ready to throw. He has the middle-class innocence of an American, except for his blunt features and dark skin that mark him as a Palestinian or a Jew, his forehead furrowed like a question, his concentration camp eyes, nervous, grim, and too intense. He has the typical blood of the exile, the refugee, the victim. Look at him looking at the catcher for a sign, so violent and competitive, so unexceptional, except for an ancestral lamentation, a shadowy grief-stricken need for freedom, laboring to express itself through him. This is called Cotton Candy. We walked on the bridge over the Chicago River for what turned out to be the last time. And I ate cotton candy, that sugary air, that sweet blue light spun out of nothingness. It was just a moment, really, nothing more. But I remember marveling at the sturdy cables of the bridge that held us up, and threading my fingers through the long and slender fingers of my grandfather, an old man from the old world who long ago disappeared into the nether regions. And I remember that 8-year-old boy who had tasted the sweetness of air, which still clings to my mouth and disappears when I breathe. This is called Branch Library. I'm trying to contact my first boyish self here when I first fell in love with poetry. A friend of mine translated this poem into Polish this summer, and so it's amusing for me to think of, because it turns out there's no such thing as a branch library in Polish. But what they have is branch of industry. So I think a sort of branch of industry makes me laugh. A minor industry, self-perpetuated, but nonetheless. Branch library. I wish I could find that skinny, long-beaked boy who perched in the branches of the old branch library. He spent the Sabbath flying between the wobbly stacks and the flimsy wooden tables on the second floor, pecking at nuts, nesting in broken spines, scratching notes under his own corner patch of sky. I'd give anything to find that birdie boy again, bursting out into the dusky blue afternoon with his satchel of scrawls and scribbles, radiating heat, singing with joy. And this is called Special Orders. My Polish translator we had an odd, funny conversation about this. There's a line. My father was a box salesman. He sold corrugated cartons. And there's a line in this poem, "Who wanted your business?" So she said, well, I want to understand that line. She goes, I understand. He's like a priest trying to help people who are in his congregation. I go, I don't think you should say that who wanted your business is like a priest. She goes, oh, I understand. He's like a nurse who wants to help patients. I go, I think I'm going to have to explain capitalism to you. So, they're learning in Poland the hard way. Special orders. Give me back my father, walking the halls of Wertheimer Box and Paper Company with sawdust clinging to his shoes. Give me back his tape measure and his keys, his drafting pencil and his order forms. Give me his daydreams on line paper. I don't understand this uncontainable grief. Whatever you had that never fit, whatever else you needed, believe me, my father, who wanted your business, would squat down at your side and sketch you a container for it. Self-portrait. I live between my heart and my head, like a married couple who can't get along. I live between my left arm, which is swift and sinister, and my right, which is righteous. I live between a laugh and a scowl, and voted against myself, a two-party system. My left leg dawdled or danced along, my right cleaved to the straight and narrow. My left shoulder was like a stripper on vacation. My right stood upright as a Roman soldier. Let's just say that my left side was the organ donor, and leave my private parts alone. But as for my eyes, which are 2 shades of brown, well, Dionysus meet Apollo. Look at Eve raising her left eyebrow while Adam puts his right foot down. No one expected to survive, but divorce seemed out of the question. I suppose my left hand and my right hand will be clasped over my chest in the coffin, and I'll be reconciled at last. I'll be whole again. I'm pleased with the title of this poem. It's called The History of My Stupidity, Volume 3, Chapter 5. We lost a really great world poet, Czesław Miłosz, this past season. And I was reading one of his poems, and in a poem of his called Accounts, and he wrote, the history of my stupidity would fill many volumes. I agreed with that. And I thought it's impossible to write all of these volumes. I'm sort of well along in life. I could write Volume 3, Chapter 5. So that's what I've done. History of My Stupidity, Volume 3, Chapter 5. Traffic was heavy coming off the bridge, and I took the road to the right, the wrong one, and got stuck in the car for hours. Most nights I rushed out into the evening without paying attention to the trees, whose names I didn't know, or the birds who flew heedlessly on. I couldn't relinquish my desires or accept them, and so I strolled along like a tiger who wanted to spring, but was still afraid of the wildness within. The iron bars seemed invisible to others, but I carried a cage around inside me. I cared too much what other people thought and made remarks I shouldn't have made. I was silent when I should have spoken. Forgive me, philosophers. I read the Stoics but never understood them. I felt that I was living the wrong life, spiritually speaking. While halfway around the world, thousands of people were being slaughtered, some of them by my countrymen. So I walked on, distracted, lost in thought, and forgot to attend to those who suffered, far away, nearby. Forgive me, faith, for never having any. I did not believe in God, who eluded me. I want to read you a poem from the point of view of Colette, the great French writer. It's from my book on love. And this book has 25 different sort of speakers, beginning with Diderot and ending with Colette, lecturing about love, giving their ideas about love. It tries to be a kind of encyclopedia about love, a lyric encyclopedia. And I decided that Colette, who is a writer I'm completely crazy about, I decided that Colette knew more about love than anyone else, and so she would get the last word. So she's speaking. My mother used to say, "Sit down, dear, and don't cry. The worst thing for a woman is her first man, the one who kills you. After that, marriage becomes a long career." Poor Cito. She never had another career, and she knew firsthand how love ruined you. The seducer doesn't care about his woman, even as he whispers endearments in her ear. Never let anyone destroy your inner spirit. Among all the forms of truly absurd courage, the recklessness of young girls is outstanding. Otherwise, there would be far fewer marriages and even fewer affairs that overwhelm marriages. Look at me. It's amazing I'm still standing after what I went through with ridiculous courage. I was made to suffer, but no one broke my spirit. Every woman wants her adventure to be a feast of ripening cherries and peaches, Marseille figs, hothouse grapes, champagne shuddering in crystal. Happiness, we believe, is on sumptuous display. But unhappiness writes a different kind of play. The gypsy gazes down into a clear blue crystal and sees rotten cherries and withered figs. Trust me, loneliness too can be a feast. Ardor is delicious, but keep your own room. One of my husbands said, "Is it impossible for you to write a book that isn't about love, adultery, semi-incestuous relations, separation?" Of course, this was before our own separation. He never understood the natural law of love, the arc from the possible to the impossible. I have extolled the tragedy of the bedroom. We need exact descriptions of the first passion, so pay attention to whatever happens to you. Observe everything. Love is greedy and forgetful. By all means, fling yourself wildly into life, though sometimes you will be flung back by life. But don't let experience make you forgetful, and be surprised by everything that happens to you. We are creative creatures fueled by passion. One final thought about the nature of love. Freedom should be the first condition of love, and work is liberating. A novel about love cannot be written while you are making love. Never underestimate the mysteries of love, the eminent dignity of not talking about love. Passionate attention is prayer. Prayer is love. Savor the world. Consume the feast with love. I want to read you one more poem, and then I want to conclude by reading you something from Pablo Neruda about the essential reciprocity of poetry. This is a little poem that Marjorie translated very beautifully into Spanish. It's called, I'm going to read it in English, which now feels like a falling off from the brilliant translation. But, it's called The Widening Sky. I am so small walking on the beach at night under the widening sky. The wet sand quickens beneath my feet, and the waves thunder against the shore. I am moving away from the boardwalk with its colorful streamers of people and the hotels with their blinking lights. The wind sighs for hundreds of miles. I am disappearing so far into the dark, I have vanished from sight. I am a tiny seashell that has secretly drifted ashore and carries the sound of the ocean surging through its body. I am so small now no one can see me. How can I be filled with such a vast love? Will we have time for questions Okay. I just want to read you this little section from Neruda, and then maybe we'll have time for a few questions. I'm back to the essential gift of poetry and the reciprocity of the relationship between the poet, the poem, and the reader. And I want to read you from a story that Pablo Neruda tells from when he was a child. He grew up in Temuco, a far outpost in southern Chile. And he tells the story of one day finding a hole in a fence board. And here's the story he tells. I looked through the hole and saw a landscape like that behind our house, uncared for and wild. I moved back a few steps because I sensed vaguely that something was about to happen. All of a sudden, a hand appeared, a tiny hand of a boy about my own age. By the time I came close again, the hand was gone, and in its place there was a marvelous white sheep. You following this? He's a boy in the backyard, and he has a hole in the fence. And he just sees this hole, and then suddenly he sees a hand, and then he sees a marvelous white sheep. So the sheep's wool was faded. Its wheels had escaped. All of this only made it more authentic. I had never seen such a wonderful sheep. I looked back through the hole, but the boy had disappeared. I went into the house and brought out a treasure of my own, a pine cone, open, full of odor and resin, which I adored. I set it down in the same spot and went off with the sheep. I never saw either the hand or the boy again. Then I say, Neruda carefully goes on to link this episode to the origin of his poetry, to the humane impulses of the lyric. To feel the love of people whom we love is a fire that feeds our life, he says. But to feed the affection that comes from those whom we do not know, from those unknown to us, who are watching over our sleep and our solitude, over our dangers and our weaknesses, that is something still greater and more beautiful, because it widens out the boundaries of our being and unites all living things. That exchange brought home to me for the first time a precious idea, that all of humanity is somehow together. It won't surprise you then that I attempted to give something resiny, earth-like and fragrant in exchange for human brotherhood. That is the great lesson I learned in my childhood, in the backyard of a lonely house. Maybe it was nothing but a game two boys played who didn't know each other and wanted to pass to the other some good things of life. Yet maybe the small and mysterious exchange of gifts remained inside me also, deep and indestructible, giving my poetry light. And then here's just one paragraph that I write about this. Neruda dreams of the imagination as an intimate medium of exchange, an intimate gift passed between strangers in the solitary backyard of a now lost house. He implies that the task of the imagination may well be to protect the vulnerability of others, watching over our sleep and our solitude. Neruda is consciously rejecting the linkage between poetry and sickness. Instead, he affirmed the essential healthiness of poetry, asking us to treat the lyric as a gift freely given and taken. To the outside world, in the practical realm of utility and commerce, this gift may seem worthless, a miniature sheep, a fragrant pine cone. But for the interior world, in the hidden realm of our affective lives, it is curiously deep and renewing. Something that might seem fragile, a group of words arranged on a page, turns out to be indestructible. Thank you. Those who can't take it anymore can leave. Yeah, they still get extra credit. They still get extra credit. Questions, thoughts. Save complaints for Marjorie later. Anyone feeling brave?
I have a friend who sends me clippings from your Washington Post column, which I adore. How do you choose the poems you write about?
Could you hear the question? This woman has a wonderful friend. I write a column for the Washington Post every week called Poet's Choice, and she clips the column and sends it to her. It's online, and the question is, how do I choose? And there's sort of the only requirement in the column is that I quote at least one whole poem, and I guess it's some combination of things between new things that I've read that have struck me, and thematic things, Christmas poems. So I have a sort of hit list of poems, say Thomas Hardy, The Oxen, or others that I already have in mind. And then I guess some other proselytizing effect of poets who I've already loved for years, and feel that there's sort of missionary part of introducing American readers to a lot of poets that they wouldn't have heard of otherwise. So some combination of my own response to new things, and then making sure that I write something about Borges, the poet, not just the fiction writer, or Marina Tsvetaeva, or Atilia Yosef, or whatever. There are a lot of poets. I mean, it seems now more than ever that as America becomes more insular, that it seems really crucial to remind people that poetry is an international activity. And so I have a lot of poets that I care about from different parts of the world, and so at different weeks I engage that. You know, I sort of find a time to write about them. Thank you.
Yes, I've heard the phrase "the illusion of intimacy" applied to what television does sometimes, making you feel as if you have an intimate relationship with that person. And then you were talking about the intimacy that occurs between the poem and a reader. I mean, the writer of the poem, the poet, and the reader are not really there, and yet they are united in some way. Is that also another order of illusion, or is that's fit into your metaphysical system in a different way?
You make them smart at your college. You make yeah. What a shock. I want to say both. That is, at some level, you're right, in the sense that there's. I mean, I think it's not like television, because it's meant one-to-one. So there's a kind of communique I think is authentic in poetry that is not there in television. I don't think it's trying to sell you anything in poetry, whereas I think that the premise of television is, I think. I mean, I could go on about the differences, I think, in terms of the kinds of experiences they convey and what they serve, and what a medium that tries to serve a mass audience does, and what a medium that works one-to-one tries to do, and why those are so radically different. But that's not really the heart of your question. Seems to me something a little different than that. So I don't want to get thrown off by the television thing, because it's easy for me to be insulted, because I think poetry is so different in its intent than television. God knows television doesn't need our defense, but poetry does. Television is not endangered, but poetry is. But what I would say is the way you're right is that there's an illusion of intimacy in the sense that you don't really literally know the person. You don't actually know the author by reading the poem in some kind of social way. I mean, if you would go up and start speaking to an author, the author might be nice or might be not, but there's some way you don't know that person. But there's another way which the person knows you and you do know them. And I think that's sometimes why there's a kind of disconnect when you actually see writers whose work you love. There's a strange disconnection because in some way you don't know them, but you have an illusion. But in some other way you really do know them. And that strikes me as authentic. And so this strikes me as, in one level, it's a kind of intimacy that you don't really have. On another, it's a kind of intimacy that you really do have, which is a kind of it kind of delivers you an inner life. And I think just one moment back to television, that's precisely what television doesn't do. It does not give you your inner life. In fact, it makes you want to forget your inner life in order to sell you something. Someone from media studies is going to be upset.
I just want to hear your thoughts on poetry using form. You spoke about sonnets and you spoke about form a little bit, because I go back and forth. You know, I think form has a lot of weaknesses, but also it can add a lot to a poem. You know, sometimes it kind of imprisons emotions.
I don't think you should think of it. That's a very good question about, and I take you mean traditional forms, because all poems have an organic form of one sort or another. But I think you mean not free verse poems, but villanelles and sestinas and sonnets and traditional forms. But I don't think that. At the heart of your question is, I think, an idea that it can add something to a poem, like some kind of dressing to a poem, or it can stop the poem, or it can imprison a poem. But I don't think that's a good way to think about it. I think a better way to think about it is that the forms do a certain kind of work in culture and in reading, and they do a work that only they can do. So that is, a sonnet carries a certain kind of information. It's particularly useful as a form. No one knows exactly why, but it's particularly useful as a form of argumentation. Now, if you have a poem, especially a love poem, in which you want to create some kind of an argument, it seems to me the sonnet is an extremely useful form to do that because it has a long history involved in that, and the poem can take on additional meaning in relationship to that history. The history, we were talking about this a little bit in the class I was in today. The history of poetry is a mausoleum of forms. That is, there are a lot of forms that died out over time. And I think forms die out when they fulfill a certain function at a given moment, and then poets write in them. And then they don't fulfill that function for another era, and so we read those forms only historically. But other forms seem to have a kind of malleability, and they survive from era to era. And so the sonnet would be one of those forms that in the 18th century it seemed to languish a little, and then it began to be revitalized, and ever since then poets have been writing sonnets ever since. What I would say about that is that the sonnet seems to carry a certain way of being. It enacts a certain kind of experience that is different than what a villanelle enacts, and that's different than what a sestina enacts. And those forms exist to carry a certain kind of information. When you have a subject matter that can be delivered most powerfully through that form, that can only realize itself through that form, then you want to write a sonnet or a villanelle. I mean, aside from our apprenticeship as poets, which is it's good to learn how to write all the forms, that you can only write in forms that you know. A wonderful example of this is Elizabeth Bishop's villanelle 1R. Because as far as I know, maybe you know differently, Frank, but as far as I know, Elizabeth Bishop only wrote one villanelle in her entire published work, and it's in her last book. It's a beautiful poem, 1R. Now, what I conclude from that, from this lesson, from this masterpiece, is that obviously Bishop is not a writer of villanelles the way, say, Shakespeare was a writer of sonnets or Petrarch was a writer of sonnets. But in writing about loss, in having a personal experience, and wanting to write about a certain kind of devastating loss and experience, she hit upon the villanelle as a form that could deliver that loss most powerfully. And she could create in that form a hierarchy of losses. And she needed the villanelle to structure that experience for herself and for the reader. And it could only be written as a villanelle. So, in other words, if she didn't know what a villanelle was and didn't know how to write, then one, she clearly could not have ever written that poem. But having that in her arsenal, she wasn't just making forms. She was finding the experience that could only be delivered through the villanelle form. That strikes me as a deeper way. Instead of the way many poets think about it, where either I don't write in traditional forms as a kind of political act, or I write in traditional forms as a political act. I think that it's more useful to think of it as the forms carry certain things. And when you have those things, you try and use those forms. And they can't do, by their very definition, they can't do other kinds of things. So that there would be a song-like quality. I mean, the villanelle originated in folk song. And there's a kind of song-like quality in the villanelle because of the refrains that you can rely on and use that's not there in the sonnet. And so if you think that song-like quality can be useful to you in terms of your particular subject, if it can release it rather than imprison it, then you turn to the villanelle or the sestina or the sonnet or whatever. And if you think it can be delivered in some other way, then you turn to something else. That is weird. I think we have a kind of privilege. We have a kind of good fortune that we have poems, we have available to us traditional forms and things that are not in traditional forms. And we can choose. And it just doesn't make sense to me to entirely throw out traditional forms, nor does it make sense to me to only write in them. If that makes sense to you.
Definitely does. I just think, like, as a very, very young poet, I've never found forms that can't say that I was trying to get across. And I was kind of amazing that at many times my clients can't feeling, but obviously there's have to change words,
Well, I think when forms are working well, you don't feel as if the form is controlling you, and that's what you're describing. You're saying changing it to make the form. I think when a form is working well, when you get as you progress. I mean, I put myself to school on these forms, so I know just what you're talking about. I was defeated by them many times, and I still have been. But when the form is controlling you, then something is wrong. But when the form enables you to say something that you wouldn't have been able to say otherwise, then I think the form is not controlling you, but you are using it. And it allows you to discover and deliver something that wasn't preordained, that you discovered in the writing of it. And that strikes me as so the writing is also a kind of discovery. And that can work in poems of free verse and organic form as well as in traditional forms. But it's hard to get to where you control the form.
How do you feel about the use of, let's say, maybe you were talking about Neruda, and he has the first early work of poems of love, and he has, like, in that Chant of Neruda, he has these poems about political situations. And we have, for example, Benedetti, who also wrote political poetry. And there are people who say that that's a real poetry.
The question is about political poetry. Yeah, but you're talking about more. Yes, it's possible to say all poetry is political, but I think that's a little bit of a cop-out for what you're actually asking, which is, what about explicitly political poetry? We don't have a very good tradition of this in North America, so we don't know how to think about this so well, I think. And yet, now I think we're going to be called upon because of what's. I mean, you can't ignore what's happening in your country, and so at a certain point, that becomes part of the way you write. I would say that. There's a certain kind of political poetry that seems to me takes certain kinds of risks. And that's poetry that wants to tell you how to vote. And there's a lot of political poetry that does that. And it can be great. It can also be embarrassing. And Neruda's a good example, because there are really great political poems in Canto General, for example, and there are really embarrassing odes to Stalin that make you wince. That he never took out of his work. And extremely explicit political poetry in this way always has characteristics like this. That doesn't mean we shouldn't write it. But I would think that there's also something else in addition to poetry that tells you what to think politically, a poetry of extreme political engagement. I would think there's also a poetry that's politically involved and aware, that's conscious of history, that isn't so much telling you how to vote, but is also aware that we exist in a political universe, and that history is part of our lives. The Eastern European poets are extremely interesting in this regard to me. And Miłosz, who I mentioned before, is extremely interesting in this regard, because it's my opinion that he didn't actually particularly want to be a political poet. I feel he wanted to be a metaphysical poet. That is, he wanted to write about God. He wanted to write about the search for eternal things. He wanted to write about truth. But he actually wasn't able just to write about those things, because you can't ignore the fact that first the Nazis and then the Soviets take over your country. And if you're a Polish writer, you can't pretend, as American writers have pretended, that you're in charge of history. You're not in charge of history. And things happen to your country. And there is a kind of pull in Miłosz's work, and actually in all of Polish poetry, of civitas. That is, there is a kind of orbit or energy or pull to pay attention to this thing that's happening. Not necessarily to intercede to tell you what to do, but the consciousness of this in poetry seems to me one of the powerful things of Polish poetry, and there's also then Miłosz sounding the call, where he felt that communism was a terrible evil, and that he needed to sound the bell in North America where people didn't understand. And of course, Neruda felt exactly the opposite. So what I would say is that for me, aside from most explicitly political poetry, that certainly in America we need a poetry of greater historical consciousness. We may not need poetry maybe we could use, but I don't feel that what we really need absolutely is a poetry of indictment. And here, I had a long argument in public with Baraka about this subject, where he feels that poetry's one task now is to stop them, to oppose the government and stop them. That's what he feels all that poetry is. I don't feel that. I don't think that poetry should lay down all its tools and just protest. I think poetry has something beyond that to offer. But I think poetry ignores what's happening to its peril. And so what I would feel is I think it's healthy for poets to feel the pressure of public events and sometimes to respond to them, which is different than a didactic poetry. And I am cautioned a little bit about the poetry of the Vietnam War, where a tremendous number of North American poets wrote poems against the Vietnam War. And now we read almost all those poems only for historical interest. But we do read a poetry of the Vietnam War that's lasted, and that's the poetry of veterans. That is, at the time, the poetry that seemed most interesting was the poetry of protest. But it turns out very little of the poetry of protest has survived. But what has survived was a poetry that took longer for us to find, which is a poetry of veterans who wrote about experiences they actually had. Now, I'm not saying that the poetry of protest shouldn't have been written. I think it was actually crucial to write those poems against the Vietnam War, and I'm glad that people wrote them. But it turns out they mostly have historical interest now. They're tied to the events. And the poetry of experience that came later doesn't seem as dependent upon the events. It survived in another kind of way.
Well, just on those lines, I'm wondering if you would consider Allen Ginsberg somewhat of a political poet of awareness, a poet of political history.
Absolutely. I think there's no question that America and Howl Part 1 and even Kaddish are very much America at that moment. And I think that the later work is something else, but the early work, I think, has a big vision about America as part of it. And I think it's part of its excitement and its energy is its engagement with what America was really like at that, in an oppositional way. So I think it's really different than other poetry of the 1950s. It really inaugurated something.
I wondered if you could say a few words about your ideal translator in any language. What does it take to be a good translator of poetry?
You mean the person who's sitting in the front row? The question was, they hate this question about ideal translators, and they always leave whenever you ask it. They like the fallen away translator. Well, I suppose the idea of the ideal translator is there may not be exactly such a thing, but the ideal translation, which the ideal translator does, is recreates a poem in another language, and that the ideal translator for me as a reader is the poet who somehow has found a way, and I think it almost always is a poet for this ideal type, of the poet who has somehow found a way to be faithful to the original poem and to recreate the poem in English. And so that you read it and it's a powerful experience in your language. that doesn't happen so often. So usually there's some kind of a compromise. And the compromise is either towards literal accuracy or towards greater poetic effect. Now, as a poet, I tend to like the greater effect rather than literal accuracy. As a scholar, I'm more interested in the accuracy. But there's a kind of scale from poems that we were talking about this at lunch today, between poems that have, say, the Penguin edition of French literature, where it's prose translations on the bottom, which don't even attempt to give you any poetic effect at all or to recreate the experience. They're just notations. And on the other side would be Dryden's notion of imitation, which Lowell used so brilliantly in his book Imitations, where he's really willing to sacrifice the literal in order to recreate the experience powerfully. Now, what you get in that is that the danger of that is you don't get Heine, you get Lowell. But you do get great poems in English, I think. You do get great poems in English. So you're not getting exactly the same thing, and so in that way it's not idealist translation. But you are getting poetry of a certain sort, where translation seems to illustrate something on behalf of the poet in imitation. And for the poet who's translating, you would say that Lowell could only get to those poems through the originals. That is, they weren't just the same as his own original poems. That he needed Baudelaire and he needed Heine to get to the things that he was writing at. That he couldn't find, Rimbaud and others that he couldn't find just on his own. But I think most translators fall between these two extremes of a literal that doesn't try to represent any of the qualities of the original, a translation that just is a scan, a trot, and something that is a radical imitation that loses a lot of the qualities of the originals, willing to sacrifice them. Most good translations, I would say, are somewhere in the middle, that make some kind of compromise between literal accuracy and poetic effect. And in the ideal translation, you somehow find a way to get both, which sometimes happens. You really get something that really is magisterial in your own language and seems also to be loyal to the original. So the person who does that would be Rabassa translating 100 Years of Solitude would be an example of that, where you get something that seems different and the original and loyal to it and spectacular in English.
Along with your involvement in poetry, I'm wondering if there are other art forms that deeply engage you as an audience and which influence or affect your poetry.
Absolutely. And if I had had more time, I would have talked, not just about me, but about poetry's relationship to these other art forms. Because poetry has a long history of engagement with music on the one side and with visual art on the other. And I'm extremely interested in those boundaries. There was a time historically where poetry and music were inseparable from each other. It's a somewhat recent invention that poetry and music have gone their own ways a little bit. For someone like Campion, they would have been the same. He wouldn't have seen the difference. But I do see the difference now as a creature of my own era, and I see that poetry boundaries music, but is something different than music. Which for me, not talking about song lyrics now, which is some step in between, but the words of poetry as music, which is an important part of poetry, seem to me related to, but somewhat different than the wordlessness of music itself, and the deep experience that I've had, and I'm sure everyone in this room has had, of music without words, that creates a tremendous feeling inside you. No one knows how this works. No one really understands what music is in this way. But it seems to be related, but somewhat different than poetry, because in poetry we have the currency of language, which is one of the detriments of poetry and one of its strengths, which is something that music is free to go its own way, different from that, with pure sound. And then On the other side of poetry, I would say, is poetry's relationship to the materialism of art. And not just poetry's, the tactile qualities of poetry, both how it looks on the page and concrete poetry, like Apollinaire's Il Pleut, that looks like rain going down, and the long history of that, which I think is a somewhat limited history, but interesting. And then there's what the Greeks called ekphrasis, which is poetry about painting, poetry in relationship to painting, and the long interrelationship between those things. But I would say the same thing, that there's a kind of materiality in art that it seems to be not quite there in poetry. And I find I've had tremendous experiences of art, especially of painting, which I adore, and it seems to me something wordless that you experience in it, in the visual, that is somewhat different than poetry, even if you tend to picture poems. I don't. But even if you tend to picture the experience of poems, it seems to be somewhat different than looking at a Hopper or looking at a Bonnard. Or looking at a de Kooning or whatever. And so, I mean, there's no hierarchy among the arts. Poetry is my own vocation and my own chosen art, but there's no hierarchy about them, and I think these arts carry things that we need. Does that seem okay for now? Or is there something else you want to say about it? You mean, is there some other intent in your question that I'm missing? Okay.
Yeah, you guys say that for a while.
Being a medievalist, I was very struck that whenever you spoke about the recipient of the work, you used the word the reader.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I hate this question. I see what's coming.
Don't ask me.
Yeah, no.
So do you see any communal role of poetry,
Yeah.
which, as you know, was oral?
Yeah.
What has happened? Is there still an oral tradition that's of significance to a contemporary culture?
Yeah. You could see actually when I'm talking about poetry, I'm really talking about lyric poetry. I'm not talking about, for example, epic poetry. I'm not talking about the way the Homeric epics, what the kind of work they would have done. I'm friends with Robert Pinsky, who, emphasizes the oral aspects of poetry. I once proposed that he and I should do an event together in which he read poems aloud and I stood up and read to myself. We should be representing what we should be representing. That's what you're talking about is a crucial dimension of poetry. I think the function of a reading now, hearing poems aloud, is very important, but it's a somewhat different function than at one time it had.
Well, I'm not even talking about, yes, but I was thinking more in terms of traditional ballads or romance, which sort of the notion of the folk author, not only the epic, but also more epical lyric forms.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any role for that?
I don't. That's a very good question. It's a question of is there a role of these forms in binding a community in a mass society? And the only way I could answer that, to say yes, would be to think that there are cultures within the mass society. That as a mass as a whole, I would say no. But as the culture is actually made up of groups within the culture, it strikes me as yes. That poetry has a function there communally towards shaping and identifying an identity, and towards narrating and towards creating a history. And so every ethnicity has its poetry. And you might even say that the role of poetry in different ethnicities in America in particular has somewhat parallel stages. I can think of, for example, a parallel stage between the role of Jewish poetry in the United States and the role of African American poetry in the United States at somewhat different times in terms of political engagement and in terms of social awareness and in terms of creating a kind of binding identity. And then also the changes as poetry begins to sort of depart from that identity politics, and the kind of problems that poets find themselves in relationship to a group mentality. And so there's a kind of a huge problematizing that I think every group runs into every poets run into in relationship to their groups, and groups run into with their poets, as poetry begins to participate in identity politics and separate from it. But you would have to help me with whether the ballad is doing the same traditional work now that it once did. I tend to think not. I tend to think it does. I think it tends to do something else. But you're absolutely right that I have overemphasized intentionally which is why I teased you about not liking this question, because I'm aware that I've overemphasized the inscribed nature of poetry as opposed to the oral nature of it, because I feel that inscribed part of it has been lost. There's a very fine book by Anne Carson called Eros the Bittersweet, in which she talks about Sappho taking two words, bitter and sweet, and putting them together. And you can stop in reading and linger over that combination and think about what it meant. And orally you can't. So, I mean, it's really thinking about the difference between lyric poetry and the Homeric epics historically, and what Homer gave us and what Sappho gave us. And the lyric as the poem for solo voice is also an experience that you can, when you're reading it, you can stop and think about it and pause and meditate about it, which I think creates a space for interiority. And I think the lyric creates a space for interiority that the epic doesn't give you. Because the epic is telling a big saga story, and because it's oral, everyone has to participate in it. But you can't stop in the middle and say, hold it, I want to think about that image. The singer is rolling ahead, because it's telling a big communal story. When we read it, we have a different experience of it. So I think the differences between oral and written are actually interesting and complicated. But what exactly the role is communally of poetry orally now, in terms of binding the community, I'm not exactly sure. I don't think it's traditional any longer, but there must be some work it does to bring people together to participate in some kind of a community. Thank you very much. Thank you.